I'm Mike Costello, and I'd like to talk to you in the next few minutes about taking out the garbage. All of us are familiar with this task. It's not something that we look forward to, but if we weren't able to take the garbage out of our homes and our apartments, we'd soon be overrun with all of this refuse. The garbage that we have in our lives comes from the things that we gather in our households. It's the things that we bring our food in, the packages that come with the things that we buy wrapped in them. And the garbage has to be taken out. When we were children, that was one of the tasks that we were given usually. And for those of us who have children today, one of the tasks or responsibilities that we give young people is to assign them the job or the chore of taking out the garbage, taking out the trash. And it is indeed a task and a chore. It's something that few of us, if any of us, look forward to, but it has to be done. And because we take out the garbage, it keeps our environment and our household clean. It also teaches our young people the responsibilities that they have in life. And the responsibilities of life sometimes are not neatly packaged, but are difficult and messy and sometimes even dirty. In our lives and in this teaching that we call metaphysical theology or philosophy, we believe that we live in our minds and not in the world. We live in our minds and not in the world. That means that the things that go on in your mind and my mind determine the quality and the fiber of our lives. The things that happen to us in our lives around us and the interaction that we have with other people certainly have a tremendous impact upon us. But what happens in our mind is really what determines how we feel about life. In metaphysical philosophy, we believe that there is a connection between human mind, your mind and my mind, our human mind and intellect, and the divine mind of God. We believe that that connection between the divine and the physical is the connectiveness that draws us to God and God to us. And we go even further by saying that we believe that the presence of God is indwelling. That is, that God and the divine essence of life resides within each heart and each mind of each human being, each living being, and that that human mind is connected to divine mind. Going back to the unpleasant task of taking out the garbage, one of the things that we believe is that our minds can collect and absorb garbage, trash, if you will, and that is really in the form of negative thoughts, negative processes of mind. And when our minds, like our houses, become overrun with garbage and trash, then the clutter creates such confusion that it's impossible for us to think clearly and to be in an environment of order and cleanliness. We believe that there is divine order in the universe and that the entire universe is always at a point of order, of perfect harmony, and perfect balance. But because of circumstances and situations and because of the way that we think about the things that happen in our lives, our minds become cluttered and become very difficult. If we begin the process of changing the way that we think, and also going through our minds, walking through our minds, and dealing with that which is positive and that which is negative, and create a method through which we can take the negative thought processes, the negative reactions, and the negative dynamics of our mind, and remove from them those negative aspects, we then begin to take the garbage out of our lives, out of our minds, and out of our existence. So often our attitudes are formed from early childhood. You have attitudes and I have attitudes, ideas and thoughts that have been shared with us by well-intentioned people and also by people who just have come into our life experience and have shared certain circumstances and situations with us, had certain events and interactions take place between us. In that process, we have created an ideation, a process of mind, that is the dynamic of mind and ideas within our thought process. Our parents formed our attitudes, our friends beginning at youth and all the way up to and including the present time in our life have formed our attitudes. And within these attitudes, we have created thought processes that have either been positive or negative, that have been those that build up our consciousness and awareness or create for us negativism and defeatism. Some negative attitudes that we may all have in our minds include envy or jealousy or judgment. They may come from anger, they may come from hurt, they may come from pain, they may come from circumstances and situations that were beyond our control. But our minds are constantly flooded from the moment that we're born until the time that we make the transition that we call death, with thought processes and attitudes that are absorbed and taken into our thought process and into our minds. If we begin the process of examining our way of thinking, looking at what it is that is within our thought process and in our minds, we begin to get a sense of how it is that our mind is functioning, what it is that our mind is drawing upon, and whether or not our mind is in connectiveness or in sync with that of divine mind and divine spirit. One of the things that we believe is that God's will for us never changes. That means that God wants for you and for me and for every living creature only the highest and the best. Circumstances and situations take place in our lives, and we begin to believe and to think that we are not deserving of the highest and the best, or we have experiences or relationships or jobs or financial challenges or health challenges that create in our thought process attitudes that are negative or destructive. If you begin the process of looking at the way that you think, if you begin the process of taking the garbage out of your thought process and out of your mind, a magnificent and wonderful thing will happen. Your attitudes will change, and your way of thinking will move into the realm of positive thought. And as you move into the realm of positive thought, the negative experiences of life will have less and less impact upon you. This doesn't have to do with the church that you go to, the faith tradition that you have, your religion. It has nothing to do with those things. It has everything to do with the dynamic of your mind and how it acts and reacts to the world. Metaphysics teach us that there is a connectiveness between mind and science and religion and spirituality. It doesn't require you to change your religion or your spirituality. It does require you, if you are to embrace our way of thinking and our concept, it does call you to a new way of thinking and to a vigilance that requires you to constantly be taking out the garbage, constantly removing the trash, if you will, from your life, and constantly being willing to make the same commitment that we teach young people, and that is that we have to take the trash out periodically so that we can have a clean and positive environment in which to live. So often we feel sluggish or depressed or hurt, and if in those times of your life you pause for a moment and go within and examine the way that your mind has been operating, examine the way that you've been thinking, you will probably find that negative attitudes and thoughts are creating the environment and the feeling and the attitude in which you find yourself at these points in time. If we're willing to get rid of that stuff, to let go of that, then we begin to take out the garbage. We begin to remove it from our environment, and we begin to direct ourselves into a new way of thinking and a new way of understanding. One of the important things that we need to do if we embark upon this process, and we all need to embark upon it, and we all need to be vigilant about it, and we all need to be continuous in our process of cleaning our environment, cleaning our mind, and taking this garbage out. We need to work hard in the process. We need to be very diligent in the process of creating a thought process and a pattern of thinking that eliminates or places aside the negative and hurtful attitudes and thought processes that we have. Those are the thought processes that we talked about a few minutes ago. Envy or jealousy, judgment, hurt, pain, resentment, all of those negative emotions. When they creep into our thinking, we need to embark upon and embrace a thought process and a thought cleansing that will allow us to move and remove those thoughts and that thinking from our process of mind. When we do that, we need to replace the void that is created with positive, affirming thoughts and thought processes. If we don't, if we remove the negative processes of thought, if we change the way that we think about the experiences of life, if we begin to let go and release jealousy and envy and judgment and pain and hurt, and we don't replace those attitudes and emotions and feelings within ourselves with positive and supportive ideas, then the space will simply be empty. And unless we condition our thought process to change and replace those void places with something positive, the old way of filling up our thoughts, filling our minds, and allowing the negative attitudes to come back in will simply be a cycle of taking out the garbage and trash and allowing more to come in. Certainly, that process goes on. But as we condition and change our way of thinking, as we embark upon a new process of mind, as we connect ourselves with the positive aspects of life, then as we remove the negatives and we replace them with positive attitudes and thoughts, the amount of space and the amount of time and the thought process that moves us from the center of peace and prosperity and positive thinking and thought into the negative aspects of thought minimize themselves and reduce. We need to replace the negatives with positives, and we need to be vigilant about the negative aspects and dynamics of our mind and thought. In New Thought, in metaphysical philosophy, we use affirmations and denials. Affirmations and denials are simply short, concise statements of spiritual reality. They're not something that we're seeking after, not something that we hope to have happen in our lives. They are statements of spiritual reality. That is an affirmation. A denial is a statement that the power of circumstances and situations that we see may be real at the moment, but the power of those negative influences over us as true people, as true spiritual beings in our inner person is extremely limited. One of the simple affirmations that we could use is, I am at peace. If we find ourselves in the midst of turmoil or confusion, depression, or anxiety, and we know that even though we're experiencing these feelings, even though this negative thought process is going on, that we can claim the reality of peace because of who we are, perfect and whole creations of a perfect and whole God who created us in the likeness and image of Himself. And because of that, we can draw to ourselves, we can project from ourselves the exact same centering force, the exact dynamic, and the exact peace that is resident in the power and the presence of God. And so if we affirm, I am at peace in the midst of a turmoil in life, it doesn't mean that the turmoil isn't there. It doesn't mean that the turmoil doesn't exist. What we're saying is, I am at peace in the midst of this experience. And as our mind is in the midst of the peaceful experience, the turbulence or the challenge or the difficulty becomes less because we know within ourselves that we are at peace. And as we begin the process of using affirmations and denials, both spoken, in the spoken form, in the written form where we read them, or in the process of mind, we affirm these realities and we create for ourselves positive affirmation in the face of challenges, in the face of difficulty. This is not an idea that is simply a Pollyanna idea of denying the reality of what we're experiencing in our lives. All of us have challenges, all of us have difficulties, all of us are faced with a myriad of opportunities in our life to be either positive or negative, to be happy or to be sad, to be peaceful or to be turbulent. And the choice is always ours, and the choice is made in our minds, in the way that we think. And as we condition and train and learn more deeply how to control our thought processes, we don't necessarily change the outer environment of the physical life, but we change what happens inside us. Every one of us have known people who seem to be very strong, seem to be overcomers, seem to be very powerful in the face of adversity and difficulty. These people are no different than you, no different than me. They are the same, but they have learned the technique that we're talking about, and that is to take out the garbage, to get rid of the negative emotions and attitudes, to allow those places to be filled with strength and power and guidance and direction. And then they're able to deal with the same problems that you deal with, the same problems that I deal with, but they deal with them in a totally different way because their mental attitude creates within them a centering place of peace, of harmony, and tranquility. And so I'd invite you to look at your mind, walk through your thought process from time to time, much as you would your house or your apartment. Maybe the garbage needs to be taken out. Maybe there's a lot of trash, and most of it is accumulated through all of the aspects of life. Maybe some of the trash and garbage in your mind has come from things that have happened in the last few days or weeks. Maybe some of it goes all the way back to your childhood. But know that you have the ability to take out the trash, that you have the ability to cleanse your mind, that you have the power to change your way of thinking, that you have the absolute ability to determine how it is you think and feel about the things that happen to you and in your life. And when you understand and grasp that concept, you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that you are empowered with the ability to deal with the circumstances and situations of life, no matter how difficult, and that you are able to be at peace, that you are able to be guided and directed to the ways in which you should act, react, and think, because your mind is connected to the mind of God. Divine mind and your mind require you to take out the garbage of negative thinking, to examine the dynamic of how your mind works and operates. The process is a simple one, but it's very difficult for many of us to get into the discipline, much as we did as children, to taking out that garbage, to looking around and cleaning up and deciding that it's time to take it out, give it up, and go outside of us and fill ourselves with the positive aspects of life. We believe in prayer as a centering force, and we'd like to invite you at this point in the program to pause for a moment of prayer and reflection with us. Eternal and loving God, we gather our hearts and minds together in the joyful anticipation of all of the ways that you will show us that we may relieve ourselves of negative thoughts and negative attitudes, hurts and pain, judgment and jealousy, and center ourselves in the divine presence of your light and life. And we know these things in the name of faith, in the name of hope, in the name of love. Amen.
That was a very timely talk about cleaning up the garbage, because we know that there's psychic garbage as well as trash that we need to relieve our homes of.
Mm-hmm. And the psychic garbage, the mental garbage, the spiritual garbage that we have so often is accumulated over a long period of time. And so we have to get into the discipline, I think, of looking at our minds and the process of our mind and determining whether or not we have a lot of negative thought and a lot of negative attitude. And if we do, it's time to take out the garbage.
And that's sometimes hard to do because we get so set in our ways. But we need to review from time to time and see what needs to be changed in our lives. It's just like when we die, I understand we have 3 days of retrospection on the inner planes. And sometimes people can't bear it right off, so the angelic beings who work with us let us postpone that for a time. But we all have to go through that time of retrospection. And if we do it every evening, it's very helpful in our lives to just review the day. Mm-hmm. That's one way.
That's a very good idea, to review the day each evening and to be able to look at how it is we're thinking about the things that happen.
Yes, in a subjective way toward our own attitudes, and see what we need to drop away and what we need to keep and what we need to nurture and what we need to just loose from our own being, and not to be judgmental any more than we'd be judgmental of others, but to do it in a very clear, concise way of planning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, planning for that process and being willing to let go of some things. Yes. And to allow some new things to come into our life.
Yes, that old cliche, let go and let God, mm-hmm. would apply there, because then we can let go the things that are not important. And also we can let go of blaming ourselves for things that we think we ought not to have done, because generally speaking, people do the best they can, and we don't want to be judgmental of others, but by the same token, not to be over-judgmental of ourselves, but just to plan to do better next time. If we've hurt someone's feelings, then make a plan to apologize. If we've been thoughtless, make a plan to correct it. But then if we do that every night, we're more apt to be calm and serene day mm-hmm. after day.
Mm-hmm. And I think the importance, too, that we need to point out is the vigilance that all of us need to have in the process of our mind, in the process of our thinking. And a good example of that is to look at how it is we respond to what's happening in our lives and in the world. Yeah. If we see what's happening in our lives at any given time with a lot of negativity, then there must be animosity, resentment, difficulty in our own thought process. If we see the world, which I think is something that happens to almost all of us at one time or another, if we become very negative about world conditions and world events, and we begin to allow our thoughts to build one upon the other in a negative direction, then it's time to begin to take the garbage out, because after all, God made the world that we're in.
Yes.
And even though it's become very fashionable and voguish, certainly in the Christian era, to talk about how bad the world is, if we look at it from a biblical standpoint, and certainly from the standpoint of what we know as religious and spiritual logic, we know that God created this world as a good place, and that the environment has been manipulated and changed by a lot of activities and a lot of thoughts, but at its core, the world is a good place.
Yes, and we need to allow it to stand and add to instead of take from in energy, because we know that we create thought forms with every thought we think. And if we think negative thoughts, we're creating negative thought forms. If we're thinking positive thoughts, we're creating the positive thought forms. And I know at church every Sunday morning, your talks are always so very uplifting and positive. And that's why people come to hear you, I know, because they have a lift toward positive living, and yet you're very pragmatic as well. And we need that in our lives. We need to be realistic and yet drop away that which is not necessary, the dross, and accentuate the positive.
Mm-hmm. Very basic concepts, but it's
Yeah.
so difficult. And why do you suppose it is so difficult for so many?
Well, I think so many ministers preach guilt and negativity, because it helps them get control of their people, because they feel, well, I'll solve your problems for you. Where you teach that we are each responsible for our own problems, but they're not insurmountable, because God is always there, and God's wonderful helpers are there helping us. Mm-hmm. And so we have that help. We just have to ask for it. Ask and you shall receive. And it's because they are trying to gain control, I think. It's just like if we look at those groups who do preach that way, they are trying to control their people very often. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's true?
I think it's absolutely true. And so often in religion, and it doesn't matter what religion, I think all religions are guilty of the process of setting limits and placing controls upon individuals and telling them that we have to do this or that, or we have to avoid this or that, when in truth, the power and grace of God is always resident within us. Yeah. And within the world, regardless of what the outer appearances seem to be. And if we can but see beyond those negative experiences of life, we can grasp the reality of who and what we are. And I think Christ Jesus was such a wonderful example. And so often in traditional thought, traditional Christian thought, he is seen as the reconciling force, the one that mediates between God and this evil world. Yeah. And we have a lot of theological evolution that has been embraced and accepted by so many people. And one of the things that we see clearly in what he was teaching was that the kingdom of God is within us, that the power of God in him and in us is the power that strengthens us and brings us to newness of life and brings us to an understanding of the Christ way of life. And that the issue is not reconciling us from a God who has separated himself from us, but reconciling our mind and thought to the understanding and realization that we have always been one with God.
Yes, and that we always can be. It's all in our own mind, as you say. We live in our minds and not in the world. So if we, in our mind, we're connected with God, the whole, we are indeed connected. If we consider Jesus as our divine way shower, then we use him as a guide for how we set the pace for our own lives. Mm-hmm. And when we use that guide, many think of him as being sorrowful, the sorrowful Christ. Well, he was joyous. One of his greatest facets of his personality was joyousness. Mm-hmm. And so if we can look at it that way, then we can use him as a guide most fully.
And his experiences, although they weren't always positive, I mean, he had many hurts and pains Indeed. And failings, sufferings in his life, but in the midst of all of those, he was able to transcend them by his way of thinking. And all the way from Bethlehem to Calvary, we see the fact that in his life, as the great way shower, which is exactly what he was, the exemplifier of the perfect life lived in this physical form, he was constantly teaching all of us as his followers that no matter what happens in life, no matter what happens to you, no matter what happens to those around you, that your connectiveness, his connectiveness to the Father and to that presence, always strengthened and empowered him. It didn't necessarily remove him from the difficulty of the pain or the negative experience, but the experience didn't control the way that he thought about his relationship between himself and God.
Yes, and he said with greatest humility, I of myself can do nothing. The Father within doeth the works. Mm-hmm. And as our way shower, then we know that we have the Father within doing however we direct that energy. And it is an energy, and it is for us to direct. And we have control of our own lives. So many people feel so helpless. Well, we do have control of how we think.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And in his way, in his instruction and example, he taught us to take out the garbage often. And that so much of what we see in life as real and is so important, up to and including death itself, is really nothing more than an illusion. And if we would just take the garbage, if we would take the negative thought out of it, then we become so free and we become so clean and we become so balanced.
Exactly. And I was prompted recently to clean out the closets in my home, because I keep my home relatively tidy, but inside some of the closets there's paper stuck miles high, and that's garbage. It needs to be cleaned out. So we need to clean out our closets of clothing that we don't use, that we know we're not going to use, of paperwork that we know we're not going to ever use again. And it's just keeping everything around us tidy, because changes the vibrations of our environment.
Absolutely. We need to clean the closets of our minds as well as we clean the closets of our homes. And Reverend Freelander and I have been sharing with you some ideas of confident living, and we hope that you found them to be useful, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Banner of might comes from the Spirit with glorious light. Confident living cleanses my soul, giving the Spirit fullest control. Confident living rights every wrong. Dynamic power helps me be strong. Confident living comforts my heart. From such a blessing I can't depart.